Welcome to the podcast, Amazing Tales About History, and I'm your host, Mike Allen. Roger Sherman, Nathan Hale, Noah Webster, Silas Deane, John Winthrop, even Benedict Arnold, all Connecticut residents who played important roles in the battle for American independence. Well, add to that list John Durkee. Now, you may not have heard of John before, but he played an important role in Connecticut right before the Revolutionary War. Now, our guest today has resurrected the memory of John Durkee. Dane Rue is president of the company Keys to History, and he's the author of the book John Durkee, The Forgotten Story of Connecticut's Bold Man from Bean Hill. He's got the story on John Durkee, and you're going to be amazed you never heard of him before. This week's trivia question: in September of 1979, a World Series of softball pitcher changed the world forever. What did his pitch do? Well, stay tuned after the main program for the answer, because then you'll know the story for next week's show. The summer of 65. Not 1965, 1765, 2 centuries earlier. It was just before the American Revolution would break open into high gear. Tensions between the Tories, those who supported the king and the crown, and the Patriots, who wanted to be free of British oversight and pursued liberty, were starting to really boil up. For the British, they had just finished fighting the 7 Years' War throughout Europe, which here in the U.S. was known as the French and Indian War. And although the British did quite well in the war, victory does come at a price, and the British were in bad financial shape. Well, they had some ideas for raising funds to make up for the shortfall, and one of them was to raise money in the American colonies by requiring a fee to send certain communications, better known as the Stamp Act. The idea was not at all warmly received. In fact, it was one of the important catalysts in sending the Patriots into high gear against the king. Now, in the summer of 1765, we started to hear about a guy in Boston named Samuel Adams because he formed the Sons of Liberty group. Now, that group operated in other areas, including Connecticut, and our guest today will tell us about one of the unsung heroes during that era, a fellow named John Durkee. Never heard of him, have you? Well, Dane Rue has. In fact, Dane's written a book about him, John Durkee, The Forgotten Story of Connecticut's Bold Man from Bean Hill. So, Dane, I want to say right up front, I'm impressed that you have brought this gentleman to our attention. It seems unbelievable that 250 years have gone by, and as you know, because you're close to this, yes, he's been mentioned in history, but he's not one of the better-known figures, and that's just saying that's an understatement, in Connecticut colonial history. Tell us about John Durkee, where he was born, and let's just sort of establish the basics of his life.
So John Durkee, his story, as you said, is not unknown, but it is certainly forgotten. Part of the reason really why I love his story so much is that he's the story of a regular person. And that sort of is a bit of an afterthought when you read and watch a lot of either programs or read books on American history. You learn a lot about the major figures like Washington and Jefferson and Hamilton, but there are millions more folks on the front lines, on the battlefields, on the home front that are quietly and sometimes, very noticeably doing work that really go unnoticed. And John Durkee is in that category. That's why his story fascinated me so much. He was born originally in Windham, Connecticut in 1728. And then right around the age of 18 or so, he comes to Norwich and lives the rest of his life in the city of Norwich. He settled in the Bean Hill district. So this is not the original Norwich Town settlement, but this is about a mile or so from that settlement in what became known as the Bean Hill neighborhood. And he had his dwelling house there. He owned other properties throughout the city and also had an inn and tavern that he maintained. And that was something that was pretty popular amongst other residents in Norwich.
Now, he goes on through his life to undertake some incredible activities. And let's start talking about this. He's in his 30s now. It's the 1760s, middle of the decade, in fact, 1765. And the unrest is starting to foment quite loudly in Boston. The name we always hear, Samuel Adams, the founder of the Sons of Liberty. But there were fomenting activities occurring in Connecticut as well. And he really took a lead in this, didn't he?
Yes, absolutely. Throughout the summer of 1765, it was not the summer of love, it was the summer of protest, all throughout New England, especially. This is happening in response to a measure known as the Stamp Act, passed by the British Parliament. And the act was passed earlier in the year. It wouldn't be implemented until later in 1765. But there was quite a large amount of protest that came up as a result of the act. This was a measure that the British designed to raise money to pay for the war efforts that came before from the French and Indian War, part of the larger 7 Years' War. And it was extremely unpopular from the onset, so much so that large pockets of resistance ended up cropping up first in Boston and then spread throughout the remainder of the 13 colonies in this loosely organized group of individuals known as the Sons of Liberty. And that's where we see John Durkee take a leading role. This is sort of a second act for him in many ways. The first act of his life was as a military man, as an officer, as part of the Connecticut provincial forces during the French and Indian War. So for a large chunk of his life, he wore the uniform in service of His Majesty King George II. And now, just barely a couple of years after the war's end, he is now leading efforts against his mother country, which is an incredible shift just in terms of his worldview. So we see that forming in the summer of 1765, where folks in Connecticut that are responsible for implementing the Stamp Act are communicating with their counterparts in Boston. Here in Connecticut, a man by the name of Jared Ingersoll is appointed Stamp Master of Connecticut, and he's talking with his counterpart Andrew Oliver in Boston. And Oliver is writing to Jared Ingersoll, essentially saying, unless you've been living under a rock for the past few months, you're pretty much aware of the harassment and the suffering that I've been subject to. And the Sons of Liberty had ransacked his home, looted his house, and just committed all sorts of terrible acts against him. And Jared Ingersoll really wasn't paying much attention to what was going on. He firmly believed that the people of Connecticut could be won over with the Stamp Act, but that was not going to be the case. So by now mid-September of 1765, Jared Ingersoll has pretty much had it with the harassment and that sort of thing. So he decides he's going to take his case before the governor of Connecticut, Governor Thomas Fitch. And Thomas Fitch is a loyalist, so he is very friendly to the British crown. And Jared Ingersoll sets out for Hartford right around September 18th to 19th, 1765. And he's essentially riding by himself for the better part of this journey. And that's when word gets out to the Sons of Liberty pockets in Connecticut that the Stamp Master is on the move from New Haven to Hartford. Word reaches Norwich, and John Durkee immediately springs into action. He immediately mounts his horse and he assembles a large body of men. Some accounts say as many as 300 to 500 folks to intercept Jared Ingersoll. And that kicks off a seminal moment in Connecticut history that very, very few people really know about. It's quite fascinating.
So, as you say, very few people have heard about this. Tell us what happened. I mean, they ride up to this character. He's by himself on a horse, just getting from New Haven to Hartford, which, by the way, was a very rocky terrain, still is, but was difficult by horseback. And these hundreds of guys get to him, and what do they do? What do they say to him?
It could have very easily gone a number of different ways. I don't know that they really had a plan as to what they were going to do with him initially. The folks that captured him, ended up capturing him, did have an end goal in mind, though they really weren't quite sure the means of which they were going to achieve that goal. But what ended up happening is that Jared Ingersoll doesn't actually make it to Hartford. He gets intercepted just outside Hartford and the town of Wethersfield. And if you go to Wethersfield nowadays, there's a plaque there on Wethersfield's Broad Street Green, and that marks where Ingersoll was intercepted by this group of Sons of Liberty and all of their affiliates. And you can just imagine for a moment being in Jared Ingersoll's shoes, being surrounded by a very large, very angry group of individuals. Some of them are likely armed, and you're by yourself. Once the group ends up intercepting him, they sort of take him into quote unquote custody and compel him to resign his post. That's the end goal here. Is they wanted all of these agents and his deputies to give up their jobs so that literally the Parliament of the Crown would have no agents to enforce the act. And they were already particularly successful in dissuading certain individuals. In fact, about a month or two before that, the gentleman by the name of Nathaniel Wales Jr., also from Wyndham, had written to Jared Ingersoll, essentially offering his services as a deputy stamp collector for the state. And not even a month after he wrote that letter, he writes back to Jared Ingersoll saying, "You know what? This has been a big mistake. This really isn't for me. I'm not really cut out for this job." So they had already gotten to him first and were successful. So now they have the main target with Mr. Ingersoll. And Ingersoll is quite stubborn. He digs his heels in and says, "I'm an official agent for the crown here. What you're doing is unlawful. This is uncivilized. This is outrageous." So he really digs his heels in initially. So John Durkee and his men decide, okay, well, he's going to act this way. So let's take him inside and give him a chance to really think it over. So they brought him in to a building right by the green into the Chester Tavern. Give him some time to think it over. After so long, Ingersoll ultimately relents because he sees himself in essentially a no-win situation, and he doesn't want this to spiral out of control. So he ends up being quoted as saying that this cause is just not worth dying for, which is pretty interesting considering the fact that all of these men, including John Durkee, had committed a terrible offense that could very well be punished by either a harsh penalty or possibly capital punishment for this action taken against him. This in turn kicks off a series of events that, again, very, very few people know about, but it really ends up changing the political trajectory of Connecticut. John Durkee played a direct role in this, in leading these men. Interestingly enough, Jared Ingersoll never even mentions John Durkee by name, and he wrote extensively about what happened to him after this incident. Doesn't ever mention John Durkee by name. He only ever refers to him as the commandant, the quote unquote commandant of the group. So nevertheless, that's what ends up happening to Ingersoll. He gives up his post, and the group escorts him to Hartford so that he could submit his resignation formally to Governor Fitch, which he does. And they really made quite a parade spectacle out of him as they're leading him to Hartford. They make him remove his hat and shout "liberty and property" 3 times, and everybody shouts a huzzah after all is said and done. So they made quite a spectacle out of him, but fortunately it did not devolve into violence. That was a pretty key detail that the Connecticut Sons ultimately wanted to abide by, as they wanted to accomplish their goals through nonviolent means, and that's what they did.
So, Dane, the point that you also make is that this changed the political trajectory, and you're absolutely right. The Sons of Liberty go on a campaign now to get Fitch himself out of the governor's office, and that was successful, wasn't it?
Yes, it was. This was the event that kickstarted again a total shift in Connecticut's political history. And for the better part of a decade, Governor Thomas Fitch and his administration had run Connecticut. We really start to see a whole new way of thinking, whether it's religious based or political based, getting into the 1750s and 60s, and particularly after the Stamp Act incident. Connecticut starts to see a wave of support for a group of folks now known as the New Lights. So we sort of see this dichotomy between new lights and old lights. Old Lights being the conservative, traditionalist wing that has been the ruling establishment in Connecticut. And now we have this group known as the New Lights, which are the more revolutionary, enlightened, progressive thinkers that want to usher Connecticut into a new age. The Sons of Liberty, in that respect, now more from just being a loose group of rabble rousers, and they form really what becomes a full-fledged political movement, an actual modern day political party. They nominate their own slate of candidates, and it was an absolute clean sweep for them. They end up getting a new governor, Governor William Pitkin, and his deputy, Governor Jonathan Trumbull, are elected that year. And it totally, again, changes the political trajectory of Connecticut. Nowadays, you would think of this as the biggest political upset you would see in an election. And we've certainly seen our fair share of those over the years.
The Susquehanna Company, we don't have time to do this story justice in this episode because the real focus was on what happened here with the Stamp Act. But I do want to mention this because John Durkee goes on, this is, I guess you would say, chapter 3 of his life, where, we're running out of land to farm in Connecticut. The good farmland is taken and families are expanding and they need new farmland, so they're branching out to the west, and they were going out to Pennsylvania. And the original charter of Connecticut gave Connecticut land all the way out to the Pacific Ocean, and for people who know that story, so they go out to northeast Pennsylvania, what is today the area around Wilkes-Barre and Scranton and the Susquehanna River. And they say, yeah, this is, we're going to settle here. And the people who were there, calling themselves Pennamites, basically Pennsylvanian people, said, no, you're not. And it was Durkee who led the group out there. And he did a couple of things while he was out there, one of which was he was the guy who named Wilkes-Barre, right? I mean, this name that nobody can ever pronounce. And tell us the history behind that name.
John Durkee was among the first European colonial Americans to enter Pennsylvania's Wyoming Valley with the band of men from Connecticut. This is, again, another almost virtually unknown part of Connecticut history that is just not taught at all. John Durkee ends up becoming a shareholder in the Susquehanna Company, which is largely run out of eastern Connecticut. They were concerned with overpopulation, if you can believe it. And nowadays, we can certainly see effects of overpopulation. But back then, they thought overpopulation was an issue. John Durkee ends up leading a band of settlers out into that area. And for the better part of 2 to 3 years, it is it's chaos, essentially. It is absolute chaos that does result in a number of violent altercations between the Connecticut men and the Pennsylvanians. John Durkee cemented his footprint in founding the town, which became Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. And for anyone that isn't familiar, the town of Wilkes-Barre has a unique name, and it's actually taken from 2 different individuals, Sir John Wilkes and Sir Isaac Barry, both of whom were members of the British Parliament. They had served previously in the 7 Years' War as officers, and John Durkee served under these men. He knew them. Not only that, but Wilkes and Barry became, believe it or not, really outspoken voices in the British Parliament in favor of the colonial Americans, not against them. In fact, there were members of Parliament on our side. Wilkes and Barry were among them. In fact, Isaac Barry was the man who coined the phrase Sons of Liberty. It wasn't even from a colonial American. It was actually from a member of Parliament that coined that name. So John Durkee wanted to pay a proper homage to his former commanders, his former officers, and they named that town Wilkes-Barre in honor of those men.
And if you visit Wilkes-Barre today, you'll see a sign that marks where the first fort was that protected Connecticut settlers against their Pennsylvania neighbors. The name? Fort Durkee. Well, that wraps up this episode of Amazing Tales About History. Today the U.S. Postal Service charges 78 cents to mail a first-class letter. When the British Stamp Act was implemented, it targeted newspapers and legal documents only, not regular letters. Still, for comparison purposes, to mail a newspaper to a subscriber cost 1 penny in the 1760s. I want to thank our guest for today's program, Dane Rue, president of the company Keys to History and author of the book John Durkee, The Forgotten Story of Connecticut's Bold Man from Bean Hill. The answer to this week's trivia question: in September of 1979, a World Series of softball pitcher changed the world forever. What did his pitch do? Well, the pitcher delivered the very first action on the Entertainment and Sports Programming Network, better known as ESPN. Next week on Amazing Tales, we're going to speak with the first executive producer of ESPN, Peter Fox, about the nail-biting effort to launch the world's first all-sports network on time in central Connecticut. You won't want to miss this interview. Amazing Tales About History is a production of True North Associates, LLC. This is Mike Allen. Be safe and stay healthy.